My name is Jake Morrison, and I've lived in rural Montana my entire 34 years. I've worked cattle, fixed more fence than I care to remember, and thought I knew everything there was to know about ranch life. That confidence nearly got me killed, and what happened afterwards still haunts my dreams. It started with a simple favor. My neighbor, old Frank Hutchinson, had passed away the previous winter, leaving his widow Eleanor to manage their sprawling cattle ranch alone. Eleanor was in her 70s, a tough woman who'd spent her entire life on that land, but some jobs were too much for her to handle solo. She called me on a Tuesday morning in late spring, her voice carrying that particular strain of someone trying to maintain pride while asking for help. The fence line between our properties had taken a beating during the harsh winter, and several posts needed replacing before her cattle wandered onto my land, or worse, onto the county road. I'd known Frank and Eleanor for 20 years. Frank had been a good neighbor, always ready to lend a hand when my own cattle got loose, or when machinery broke down during critical times. Helping his widow was the least I could do. Besides, the job looked straightforward. Replace a dozen rotted posts along about a quarter-mile of fence line. Eleanor met me at the gate that morning, her weathered hands gripping a thermos of coffee and a worried expression creasing her face. She seemed more anxious than the job warranted, but I attributed it to the general stress of managing the ranch alone. "The posts are along the north pasture," she said, pointing toward a section of land I'd never worked before. "That's where the damage is worst." I loaded my tools and headed out, completely unaware that I was walking into a nightmare that would change everything I thought I knew about my Chapter 2. The North Pasture. The North Pasture stretched out before me like something from a postcard. Rolling green hills dotted with cattle, wooden fence posts marking clean property lines, and the kind of big sky that makes you understand why people choose this life despite its hardships. The damaged section was obvious from a distance, posts leaning at dangerous angles, wires sagging so low that even the laziest cow could step over it. I parked my truck near the fence line and began unloading tools. The work was familiar and satisfying, digging out old posts, setting new ones, stretching wire tight. The morning sun warmed my back as I worked, and I fell into the rhythm that comes from years of physical labor. What I didn't immediately notice was the bull. Frank's cattle had always been docile, well-managed animals that barely looked up when humans passed by. But this bull was different. He stood about 50 yards away, massive and black, watching me with an intensity that should have set off alarm bells. His head was lowered slightly, and he pawed the ground occasionally, classic signs of agitation that I somehow missed in my focus on the work. Eleanor had mentioned that Frank had bought some new breeding stock before his death, animals from a ranch in Texas that specialized in aggressive bloodlines. She'd seemed uncomfortable discussing it, changing the subject quickly when I asked about the herd's temperament. By noon, I'd replaced 6 posts and was making good progress. The bull had moved closer, now maybe 30 yards away, but I still didn't grasp the danger. Ranch bulls can be unpredictable, but they usually give clear warnings before attacking. This one was different, silent, calculated, waiting. I was bent over, securing wire to a post, when I heard the sound that still wakes me up at night. The thundering of hooves on hard ground, getting closer fast. When I looked up, 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury was bearing down on me with murderous intent. Chapter 3. The attack time slowed to a crawl as the bull charged. I had maybe 3 seconds to react, and my options were limited. The fence was to my right, my truck 30 yards behind me, and open pasture everywhere. I chose the fence, diving toward the wooden posts, and hoping the bull would pull up short rather than risk injuring himself. I was wrong. The bull hit me just as I reached the fence line, his massive head catching me in the ribs and launching me into the air. I felt something crack. Ribs. Definitely, maybe more, before I crashed into the fence posts with enough force to snap one. The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain through my entire body. But the bull wasn't finished. As I struggled to get my bearings, he wheeled around for another charge. This time I managed to roll behind the broken fence post, using it as a partial shield. His horn caught me in the thigh, tearing through denim and flesh like it was paper. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled toward my truck, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. The bull followed, his breathing heavy and aggressive, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the fence line itself, or some ingrained training, but he stood there watching as I dragged myself the final yards to safety. By the time I reached my truck, I was going into shock. Blood soaked my jeans, and every breath sent fire through my chest. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. The first call went to 911, the second to Eleanor. "There's been an accident," I managed to say when she answered. "Your bull, I need help." Her response still chills me. "I'll be right there. Don't call anyone else." Chapter 4. Eleanor's arrival. Eleanor arrived before the ambulance, driving her old pickup across the pasture with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman her. She parked between me and the bull, who had retreated but was still watching from a distance, and climbed out with a rifle in hands. "How bad is it?" she asked, but her eyes weren't on my injuries. She was scanning the area, looking for something I couldn't identify. "Bad enough," I gasped. "That bull, there's something wrong with him. He didn't just charge, he hunted me." Eleanor's face went pale, and she gripped the rifle tighter. "You need to listen to me very carefully, Jake. When the paramedics get here, you tell them you were kicked by a horse. A horse, not a bull. Do you understand?" I stared at her, wondering if the blood loss was making me hallucinate. "What? Why would I lie about what happened? Because if you don't, people are going to start asking questions I can't answer." Her voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before. "Please, Jake, I'm begging you, say it was a horse." The sound of sirens grew louder, and Eleanor's agitation increased. She kept glancing toward the bull, who had moved closer again, as if drawn by some invisible force. There was something in her expression, fear, guilt, and something else I couldn't name. "Eleanor, what's going on? What aren't you telling me?" She knelt beside me, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she examined my wounds. "Some secrets are buried for good reasons, Jake. Frank knew that. He took precautions. But after he died," she trailed off, shaking her head. The ambulance crested the hill, and Eleanor stood up quickly. "Remember, it was a horse. A spooked horse that kicked you, nothing more." As the paramedics approached, I found myself nodding, though I had no idea why I was agreeing to lie about what had nearly killed me. Chapter 5. The hospital. The emergency room at County General was a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and the sharp smell of antiseptic. The doctors worked quickly to assess my injuries. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep laceration on my thigh that required 37 stitches. I was lucky to be alive, they said, though it would be weeks before I was back to full strength. When the attending physician asked about the accident, I found myself repeating Eleanor's story almost automatically. "Spooked horse," I said. "Caught me with a back kick when I wasn't paying attention." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes on his chart. "We see a lot of horse injury. They're powerful animals, and even the gentle ones can be dangerous when they're startled." But as he examined my wounds more closely, his expression grew puzzled. "These injuries are unusual for a horse kick. The pattern of trauma, the depth of the laceration. Are you sure about what happened?" I felt a cold sweat break out despite the pain medication. "Pretty sure. Everything happened so fast." Dr. Martinez didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Small-town doctors learn to respect their patients' privacy, especially when it comes to ranch accidents that might involve insurance claims or liability issues. Eleanor arrived at the hospital an hour later, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing the expression of a concerned neighbor. She sat beside my bed, her presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. "How are you feeling?" she asked. But her eyes were scanning the room, checking to see if we were alone. Like I got hit by a freight train. "Eleanor, we need to talk about what really happened out there." She glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "Not here. Too many ears. But Jake, you did the right thing. You don't know how important that was." "Important to who and why?" Eleanor's face aged 10 years, and to everyone in this valley. There are things about Frank's ranch, about that bull, that go back further than you. Chapter 6. The recovery. I spent 3 days in the hospital, and Eleanor visited every day. She brought homemade soup, helped with paperwork, and played the part of the caring neighbor perfectly. But I could see the strain in her eyes, the way she jumped whenever someone entered the room unexpectedly. On the second day, Sheriff Tom Bradley stopped by. Tom had been the law in our county for 15 years, and he knew every rancher, every family, and every piece of gossip within 50 miles. His visit seemed routine at first. "Heard you had a run-in with a horse, Jake," he said, settling into the visitor's chair. "Eleanor tells me it was one of her mares that got spooked." I nodded, sticking to the story, but Tom's expression suggested he wasn't entirely buying it. "Funny thing, though, I drove by the north pasture yesterday, and I didn't see any horses in that area, just cattle." Eleanor, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, spoke up. "The horses are in the south pasture now, Tom. I moved them after the accident." "Makes sense," Tom said, but his eyes never left my face. "Jake, you've been around livestock your whole life. Not like you to get careless around a spooked animal." "Everyone has off days," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom nodded slowly. "I suppose they do. Well, you take care of yourself. And Eleanor, if you need any help managing that ranch, you know you can call on me." After he left, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Tom's suspicious. He's always been too smart for his own good. Maybe because the story doesn't make sense. Eleanor, I need to know what's really going on. That bull didn't just attack me. It was like it was programmed to kill." Eleanor set down her knitting and looked directly at me for the first time since the accident. "Some programs can't be undone, Jake. Frank learned that the hard way." On Chapter 7, the truth begins. On my last night in the hospital, Eleanor finally began to tell me the truth. She waited until visiting hours were nearly over and the hallways were quiet before pulling her chair close to my bed. Frank wasn't just a rancher, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. During the war, Vietnam, he worked for the government in ways that weren't supposed to exist. Animal behavior modification, they called it. Training animals for special purposes. I stared at her, wondering if the pain medication was making me hallucinate. What kind of special purposes? The kind that required animals to kill on command. Dogs mostly, but they experimented with larger animals too. Frank was good at it. Too good. When he came home, he tried to leave that life behind, but some skills, some knowledge, it follows you. Eleanor's hands shook as she continued. That bull wasn't born aggressive, Jake. Frank trained him. Not for the government this time, but for protection. There were people from his past who might come looking for him. People who knew what he was capable of. Protection from who? Men who did terrible things during the war and wanted to make sure no one could testify about. Frank knew too much, had seen too much. So he created a guardian, something that would kill anyone who came onto his property with hostile intent. The pieces began falling into place. But I wasn't hostile, I was just fixing fence. Eleanor's face crumpled. That's what makes this so terrible. Frank died before he could properly deactivate the conditioning. The bull was trained to attack anyone who approached certain areas of the property. Areas where Frank buried evidence of what he'd done overseas. Evidence? Photographs, documents, recordings, proof of war crimes that could have brought down some very powerful people. Frank kept it as insurance, but after he died, she trailed off, wiping tears from her eyes. The bull was still protecting secrets that might not need protecting anymore. Eleanor nodded. And now you know why you can't tell anyone what really happened. Chapter 8. The Weight of Secrets. I was discharged the next morning. But Eleanor's revelation had left me with more questions than answers. As she drove me home, I pressed her for more details about Frank's past and the true nature of the danger that might still exist. The men Frank was worried about, are they still alive? I asked. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tighter. Some of them. Frank kept track over the years. 3 of his former unit members died under suspicious circumstances in the 80s and 90s. Heart attacks, car accidents, hunting mishaps. Frank was convinced they were being eliminated one by one, and he thought he was next. He knew he was next. That's why he bought the bull, why he trained it. Frank was many things, but he wasn't paranoid. If he said someone was coming for him, someone was coming. We drove in silence for several miles before I asked the question that had been haunting me. Eleanor, what's buried on your property? What was the bull really protecting? She pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the... For a long moment she stared out at the rolling hills that surrounded us. Frank documented everything during his time in Southeast Asia. Every operation, every target, every order that came down from above. He had photos of mass graves, recordings of officers ordering the execution of prisoners, evidence of chemical weapons being used on civilian populations. Jesus Christ. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, Jake, but he was a soldier following orders. And when he realized how those orders might be used against him later, he protected himself the only way he knew how. By keeping evidence. By keeping evidence and creating a guardian that would kill anyone who tried to take it. Eleanor started the engine again. Frank died of a heart attack, but I sometimes wonder if that was really natural causes. Maybe someone finally found a way to get to him that didn't involve approaching the property. As we pulled into my driveway, Eleanor turned to me with an expression of desperate sincerity. Jake, you have to promise me you'll never go back to that north pasture. The bull is still there, still programmed, still dangerous. What are you going to do about it? I don't know. Frank never told me how to undo what he'd done. Chapter 9. The Research. Despite Eleanor's warnings, I couldn't let the matter rest. During my recovery, I spent hours researching Frank's military service and the covert programs that had operated during the Vietnam War. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. Project MKUltra was just the tip of the iceberg. The military had conducted extensive research into animal behavior modification, training everything from dolphins to detect underwater mines to dogs programmed for assassination missions. Most of these programs were officially discontinued in the 1970s, but rumors persisted that some research had continued in private facilities. Frank Hutchinson's name appeared in several declassified documents, always in connection with behavioral conditioning protocol and enhanced animal training techniques. He had been part of a special unit that developed methods for creating what they called biological weapon systems. Animals so thoroughly conditioned that they would carry out specific tasks, regardless of circumstances. The more I read, the more I understood Eleanor's fear. If Frank had applied these techniques to create a guardian for his property, the bull would be operating on a level of programming that went far deeper than normal animal training. It wouldn't just be aggressive, it would be a living weapon, designed to kill without hesitation or mercy. But there was something else in the documents that caught my attention. Several researchers had noted that the conditioning techniques, while effective, were also unstable. Animals subjected to intensive behavioral modification often became increasingly unpredictable over time, their programming degrading in ways that made them dangerous to everyone around them. I called Eleanor to share what I'd learned. The bull isn't just protecting your property, and I told her. According to these reports, its conditioning is probably breaking down. It's becoming a threat to everyone. There was a long silence before Eleanor responded. Frank warned me about that. He said if anything happened to him, I'd have maybe a year before the bull became completely uncontrollable. How long has it been since Frank died? 11 months. Chapter 10. The Plan. Eleanor and I met the next evening to discuss our option. She had spent the day researching local veterinarians and animal behavior specialists, trying to find someone who might be able to help with the bull. The results were discouraging. No one wants to touch it, she said, settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of coffee. I described the situation, without mentioning the conditioning, of course, and every vet I called said the same thing. An aggressive bull that size is too dangerous to work with. They all recommended putting it down. Maybe that's the best option. Eleanor shook her head. Frank spent 2 years training that animal. It represents thousands of hours of work, and more importantly, it's the only thing standing between those buried documents and whoever might still be looking for. Eleanor, you said yourself that the conditioning is breaking down. How long before it attacks someone else? What if it gets out of the pasture? The fencing is reinforced. Frank made sure of that, and the bull has never shown aggression toward me because Frank programmed it to recognize you as safe. But what happens when that programming fails completely? We sat in silence, both understanding the impossible situation we faced. The bull was simultaneously a protection and a threat, a guardian that was slowly becoming a monster. Finally, Eleanor spoke. There might be another option. Frank kept detailed notes about the conditioning process. If we could find them, maybe we could figure out how to reverse what he... Where would he keep something like that? In his study. He had a safe behind his desk where he kept important papers. I never opened it after he didn't know the combination. But you think the reversal process might be documented? Frank was methodical about everything. If there was a way to undo the conditioning, he would have written it down. Eleanor paused, then added, the problem is getting to the safe. It's in the house, which means crossing the north pasture. The bull's territory. Exactly. Chapter 11. The Return. 3 weeks after the attack, against every instinct I possessed, I found myself preparing to return to Eleanor's ranch. My ribs were still tender, and the scar on my thigh pulled painfully when I walked. But Eleanor was right about one thing. We needed those documents before the bull's conditioning deteriorated further. We planned the approach carefully. Eleanor would drive to the far end of the north pasture and use a horn to draw the bull's attention, while I slipped into the house from the opposite direction. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best we could manage given the circumstances. The morning was overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror my mood as we drove toward the... Eleanor was unusually quiet, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Are you sure about this? I asked as we approached the property. No, she replied honestly, but I'm sure about what happens if we don't try. That bull is getting worse, Jake. Yesterday I saw it charge the fence line for no reason at all. It's only a matter of time before it breaks through. We parked near the main house, and I could see the bull in the distance, standing motionless in the center of the pasture like a black monument to violence. Even from several hundred yards away, its presence was intimidating. Eleanor handed me a key to the house and a piece of paper with the safe combination. Frank's birthday, followed by the year we were married, she explained. He wasn't creative with passwords. How long do you think you can keep it distracted? Long enough. The horn usually gets its attention for at least 10 minutes. Just be quick. I watched Eleanor drive toward the far fence line, then turned toward the house. Frank's study was on the second floor, overlooking the north pasture. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear the distant sound of Eleanor's horn, and more ominously, the thundering of hooves as the bull responded to the distraction. The safe was exactly where Eleanor had said it would, hidden behind a framed photograph of Frank in his military uniform. My hands shook as I entered the combination, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might not work. Then, the safe clicked open, revealing a treasure trove of documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my neighbor. Chapter 12. The Documents. Frank's safe contained more than just conditioning protocols. There were photographs that made my stomach turn, recordings that documented atrocities I couldn't have imagined, and correspondence with government officials who had clearly been involved in covering up war crimes. But it was the conditioning manual that held my immediate attention. Frank had documented every step of the bull's training with scientific precision, creating a guide that read like something from a nightmare. The process had taken 18 months and involved techniques that bordered on torture, systematically breaking down the animal's natural instincts and rebuilding them according to Frank's specification. The reversal process was equally detailed and equally disturbing. It required specific verbal commands, delivered in a precise sequence, combined with visual cues that would trigger the animal's original conditioning. But there was a warning written in Frank's handwriting that made my blood run cold. Reversal process must be initiated by original Alternative methods carry 90% fatality rate for operate. Frank was dead. The only person who could safely reverse the bull's conditioning was gone, leaving behind a living weapon that was slowly becoming more dangerous with each passing day. I was so absorbed in reading the documents that I almost missed the sound of Eleanor's horn stopping. In the sudden silence, I could hear something much worse, the sound of hooves approaching the house at a dead run. I rushed to the window and saw the bull charging across the pasture, no longer distracted by Eleanor's attempts to draw it away. Somehow, it had figured out that the real threat was at the house, and it was coming straight for me. The front door was on the ground floor, directly below Frank's study. I could hear the bull's breathing as it reached the porch, followed by the splintering of wood as it began trying to break down the door. The house shook with each impact, and I realized that the door wouldn't hold for long. I grabbed the documents and looked around desperately for another way out. The study had a window that opened onto the roof of the back porch, but it was a 15-foot drop to the ground. With my injuries, I might not survive the fall. The sound of splintering wood grew louder, and I made my choice. Chapter 13. The Final Truth. I climbed through the window and dropped onto the porch roof just as the bull broke through the front door. The impact sent lightning bolts of pain through my healing ribs, but I managed to keep hold of the documents. From the roof, I could see Eleanor driving frantically across the pasture, trying to reach the house before the bull found me. But as I prepared to jump to the ground, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was another vehicle approaching the ranch, a black SUV with government plates that was moving fast across the county road. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had been watching the ranch, waiting for exactly this moment when Eleanor and I would be vulnerable and distracted. I watched as 3 men in dark suits emerged from the SUV, moving with military precision toward the house. They were armed and clearly knew exactly what they were looking for. Frank's paranoia hadn't been paranoia at all. Someone really had been coming for, and now they were coming for his secrets. The bull, hearing the approaching strangers, abandoned its pursuit of me and charged toward the new arrivals. What followed was a scene from a nightmare as 2,000 pounds of conditioned fury met 3 men who had no idea what they were facing. Eleanor reached the house just as the chaos erupted. She found me on the porch roof, clutching Frank's documents and watching in horror as the bull did exactly what it had been trained to do: eliminate threats to the property with extreme prejudice. When it was over, Eleanor and I sat in stunned silence, surrounded by evidence of Frank's dark past and the violent present. The bull stood in the distance, calm now that the threat had been neutralized, but still dangerous, still programmed, still a weapon waiting for the next target. "What do we do now?" I asked. Eleanor looked at the documents in my hands, then at the bull, then at the scene of carnage around us. "We call Sheriff Bradley," she said finally, "and we tell him the truth, all of it, even about the conditioning, especially about the conditioning. Frank's secrets died with those men, but the bull is still alive, still dangerous. People need to know what they're dealing with." As we waited for the authorities to arrive, I realized that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, no matter what the consequences of revealing them might be. Frank had tried to protect his past by creating a monster, but monsters have a way of outliving their creators. The bull still stands in that north pasture, and Eleanor still lives on the ranch. The government men were officially listed as victims of a livestock accident, and Frank's documents were quietly seized by federal agents who arrived within hours of our call. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of hooves on hard ground, and I remember the look in that bull's eyes as it charged toward me. Some conditioning runs too deep to ever be completely erased, and some truths are too terrible to ever be completely buried. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not easy to share something this personal and disturbing, but I believe people need to know that the past has a way of reaching into the present, sometimes with deadly consequences. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from people all over the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories that will make you question everything you think you know about the people around you.